The autumn light fell golden across Hyde Park on that late September afternoon in 1819, casting long shadows through the canopy of trees whose leaves had begun their slow surrender to the season, and it was into this gentle tableau that Frederick Ashworth, Duke of Somerton, walked with his son's small hand clasped firmly in his own, the child's wooden horse clutched in his other fist as they made their way along the gravel path during the fashionable hour when all of society came to see and be seen. Frederick wore grey, the colour of half-mourning that had become his armour these past 2 years since Arabella's passing, and though the ton whispered that he should return to proper dress, he found he could not quite release this last vestige of propriety that kept the matchmaking mummers at bay. Oliver, just 4 years old with his father's dark hair and a temperament far gentler than Frederick's own had ever been, tugged at his hand and pointed at the ducks upon the Serpentine, at the ladies with their parasols, at everything that caught his bright and curious eye. Frederick had learned to walk slowly for his son's sake, to pause when wonder demanded it, and so he did not immediately notice the woman seated alone upon the bench some 20 paces ahead, her figure draped in the unrelieved black of deep mourning, her face turned toward the water where the afternoon sun painted ripples of light. It was Oliver who noticed first, as children do, his small voice cutting through Frederick's distracted thoughts with the innocent cruelty that only the very young possess. "Papa, why is that lady crying?" the boy asked, and Frederick's gaze lifted from his son's upturned face to follow the direction of his pointing finger, expecting nothing more than a stranger's private grief, perhaps a recent widow overcome by the beauty of the day or the absence of the one who should have walked beside her. What he found instead stopped his heart. She sat with her shoulders curved inward, as though protecting herself from a blow, her gloveless hands pressed to her face, and though 5 years had passed since he had last seen her, though he had told himself 1,000 times that she had forgotten him, that she had married well and found happiness, he knew her instantly, knew her as he knew his own reflection, knew her as he knew the weight of the guilt he had carried every day since that terrible summer morning when he had spoken words designed to destroy her love and set her free. Eleanor. The name rose unbidden to his lips, though no sound escaped them, and in that moment the years collapsed like a house of cards. And he was 26 again, desperate and cornered, his father's threats ringing in his ears as he told the woman he loved that she had meant nothing, that she had been merely a pleasant diversion, that she should forget him as easily as he would forget her. She looked up. Their eyes met across the golden afternoon, and Frederick Ashworth, who had faced down Napoleon's cavalry at Waterloo without flinching, found himself utterly frozen, past and present colliding with such force that he could not breathe, could not move, could not do anything but stare at the face of the woman he had destroyed, the woman he had never stopped loving, the woman whose tears even now traced silver paths down cheeks that were thinner than he remembered, more angular, touched by the unmistakable shadow of suffering that he himself had set in motion. Long years ago. The moment stretched between them like a held breath, seconds becoming hours in the space of a heartbeat, and Frederick found that his carefully constructed walls, the ones he had built brick by brick over 5 long years, were crumbling to dust beneath the weight of her gaze. She was changed, his Eleanor, though he had no right to call her his any longer, no right to the possessive tenderness that surged through him as he catalogued every difference that time and hardship had written upon her face. The softness of youth had given way to something more angular, more defined, her cheekbones standing in sharper relief beneath skin that had lost the rose-petal bloom he remembered from summer afternoons at Thornfield, when she had laughed at his poor attempts at poetry, and he had thought himself the luckiest man in all of England. Her dress, he noticed with a pang that bordered on physical pain, was well made but worn at the cuffs and collar, the black bombazine of deep mourning hanging upon her frame in a way that spoke of weight lost to grief or circumstance or both, and her hands, those elegant hands that had once reached for his with such innocent trust, were bare of gloves despite the crisp September air. "Papa," Oliver tugged at his hand again, his small voice piercing the fog of Frederick's shock. Why does she not stop crying? And the question, so simple and so devastating, seemed to reach Eleanor as well, for she pressed her bare fingers more firmly against her cheeks as though she could will the tears away through sheer determination. Frederick watched her struggle for composure, watched the way her throat worked as she swallowed, watched the desperate blinking that failed to clear the brightness from eyes that were the same shade of grey-blue he saw in his dreams, the colour of the sky after rain, as Oliver would later say with the unwitting poetry of childhood. She recognized him. He could see the exact moment when confusion became certainty, when the features of the man before her resolved into the ghost she had buried half a decade ago, and what he saw in her expression then was not the hatred he deserved, but something far worse, a flash of such raw and undefended pain that he felt it like a blade between his ribs. Eleanor, he spoke her name aloud for the first time in 5 years, and his voice emerged rough and broken, nothing like the practiced tones of a duke addressing a former acquaintance, everything like a man who had just stumbled upon the wreckage of his greatest mistake. Her composure shattered further at the sound of her name in his mouth, and she rose from the bench so quickly that she swayed, one hand reaching back to steady herself against the iron armrest, while the other remained pressed to her heart as though to keep it from escaping her chest. Frederick saw movement at the periphery of his vision, an elderly woman in a blue shawl beginning to make her way toward them with the determined gait of a protector who sensed her charge in distress, and he knew that whatever came next would be witnessed, that the curious eyes of society were already turning toward this peculiar tableau of a duke in grey half-mourning and a widow in black standing frozen in recognition while a small boy looked between them with the uncomplicated concern of innocence. "Your Grace," Eleanor spoke first, and the title fell from her lips like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward with all the formal distance that 5 years of silence had carved between them, and Frederick flinched at the sound of it, at the way she wielded propriety like a shield, though he knew he deserved nothing less, knew he had forfeited the right to hear his Christian name shaped by her voice on that terrible morning when he had watched her face crumble and done nothing to stop it. "Mrs. Whitmore," he returned, matching her formality even as the name of another man upon her identity cut him more deeply than he had anticipated, and he saw her register the acknowledgement of her married state, saw something flicker in those grey-blue eyes that might have been pain or might have been surprise that he knew, that he had followed her story even from the distance he had imposed between them. The fashionable hour continued its parade around them, ladies in bright walking dresses casting curious glances at the tableau they presented, a duke in half-mourning and a widow in black, and a small boy who tugged at his father's coat with increasing urgency. But Frederick could not bring himself to care about the whispers that would surely follow, could not tear his attention from the woman before him who stood so straight, so proud, despite the tears that still glistened upon her cheeks. "I was sorry to hear of Lady Ashworth's passing," Eleanor said, and her voice held the careful neutrality of one offering condolences to a stranger, though they both knew she was no stranger, had never been a stranger, not even now when the chasm of years and lies stretched impossibly wide between them. Frederick opened his mouth to respond, to offer his own condolences for the husband she had lost, but before he could form the words, Mrs. Fairfax arrived at Eleanor's side in a rustle of blue wool and quiet determination, her silver-headed walking-stick tapping against the gravel path as she positioned herself as both chaperone and guardian. "Eleanor, my dear, we should continue our walk before the air grows chill," the elderly woman said, though her sharp eyes moved between them with an intelligence that suggested she understood far more than mere concern for the weather, and Eleanor grasped at the offered escape with visible relief, her bare fingers closing around Mrs. Fairfax's arm as though it were a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "Of course, Mrs. Fairfax," Eleanor murmured, already beginning to turn away, and Frederick felt panic rise in his throat at the thought of watching her disappear again, of letting 5 more years pass in silence and regret. "Papa!" Oliver's voice cut through his paralysis, clear and bright and utterly innocent of the devastation surrounding him. Will the sad lady come visit us so I can show her my horses?" And Eleanor stopped mid-turn, her gaze dropping to the child, who looked up at her with Frederick's dark hair and eyes full of uncomplicated hope. And for one moment, Frederick saw her composure waver, saw the softness she had always carried for children break through the armor she had constructed against him. She could not bring herself to answer the child, could not form words past the sudden constriction in her throat as she looked down into that small, earnest face that bore such an unmistakable resemblance to the man who had shattered her heart 5 years ago, and so she did the only thing her pride would allow. She inclined her head in the barest acknowledgement of Oliver's invitation, and then turned away, Mrs. Fairfax's arm steady beneath her trembling fingers as they began the long walk toward the park's edge, where their hired carriage waited. Frederick watched them go, paralyzed by the same helplessness that had gripped him on that terrible morning when he had spoken the words his father had demanded, the lies that had dimmed the light in Eleanor's eyes and sent her fleeing from his presence, and he found that his feet would not move, that his voice would not call out, that he was condemned to stand frozen while she walked away from him for the second time in his life. "Papa, she is leaving," Oliver observed with the matter-of-fact disappointment of childhood, tugging at Frederick's hand as though he might pull his father into pursuit. And when Frederick looked down at his son, he saw confusion written plainly across those small features. Confusion, and something that looked remarkably like reproach, as though even a child of 4 could sense that something important was slipping away with each measured step Eleanor took across the golden carpet of fallen leaves. "She walks very straight," Oliver continued, his dark eyes tracking Eleanor's retreating figure with an intensity that seemed far beyond his years. "But I think she is sad inside, Papa. I think she needs someone to be kind to her." And Frederick felt those simple words pierce through the armor he had constructed around his heart with more precision than any blade. Mrs. Fairfax guided Eleanor toward a modest carriage that bore no crest, no indication of rank or wealth, and Frederick strained to hear as the elderly woman instructed the driver, her voice carrying on the crisp autumn air with the clarity that distance sometimes grants. 14 Wimpole Street, she said, and Frederick committed the direction to memory with the desperation of a man grasping at the last thread of hope. "Papa," Oliver tugged again, more insistently now. "She has eyes like the sky after rain. Did you see?" And Frederick could only nod, his throat too tight for speech as he watched Eleanor pause at the carriage door, watched her shoulders rise and fall with a breath that seemed to cost her everything. And then, just before she stepped inside, she turned, one brief backward glance that found him across the expanse of the park with the unerring accuracy of a heart that remembered despite itself. Their eyes met for one suspended moment, and Frederick saw in her face the same devastating mixture of longing and loss that he felt burning in his own chest. And then she was gone, the carriage door closing behind her like the final page of a chapter he had been too cowardly to write differently. "She is very pretty," Oliver said solemnly as the carriage pulled away, and Frederick's grey gloves tightened around his son's small hand as he made a decision that felt like both salvation and damnation. He would find her again. He would tell her the truth. He would beg her forgiveness, even knowing he did not deserve it. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The fire had burned low in the grate by the time Frederick finally allowed himself to cross to the mahogany cabinet in the far corner of his study, the cabinet whose key he wore on a chain beneath his waistcoat, the cabinet he had not opened in nearly 3 years because the contents within held the power to unmake him entirely. And yet tonight, with the rain beginning its soft percussion against the windows of Somerton House and Oliver safely asleep in the nursery above, he found his fingers moving to the lock with the inevitability of a man who has resisted temptation too long and finally surrenders to its pull. The drawer slid open with a whisper of polished wood, and there they lay, the artifacts of his greatest happiness and his most unforgivable sin, a miniature portrait no larger than his palm showing Eleanor as she had been at 20, all soft hope and luminous eyes, and a smile that had been meant only for him, and beside it a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon that had once adorned her hair, letters he had written but never sent, letters full of explanations and apologies that had seemed too dangerous to deliver and too precious to destroy. He lifted the miniature into the firelight, and her painted face gazed back at him with none of the wariness he had seen that afternoon, none of the careful composure that 5 years of believing herself unloved had carved into her features, and he remembered the summer at Thornfield when they had walked through the gardens at dusk, and she had laughed at his clumsy poetry, and he had known with absolute certainty that he would love no other woman as long as he lived. The door to his study opened without warning, and Frederick turned sharply to find Henry Carstairs standing on the threshold, his cousin's familiar face creased with concern that suggested he had heard about the encounter in the park, had perhaps witnessed some portion of it from a distance, and Frederick made no move to hide the miniature in his hand, because Henry knew, had always known, had been the only one Frederick trusted with the truth of what his father had done. "I thought I might find you here," Henry said quietly, closing the door behind him and crossing to pour 2 glasses of brandy from the decanter on the side table, though Frederick knew he would not drink his, could not stomach anything, while Eleanor's young face smiled up at him from the painted ivory, and Henry settled into the chair opposite, without waiting for invitation, because they had long since dispensed with such formalities between them. "You saw her," Frederick said, "and it was not a question," and Henry nodded slowly, his eyes moving to the miniature that Frederick still clutched like a talisman against the weight of his own regret. The portrait that had been commissioned in secret during those golden weeks when he had believed nothing could prevent their happiness. "Your father has been dead 3 years, Frederick," Henry said, with the gentleness of a man delivering news that was both liberation and condemnation. And Frederick felt the words land like stones upon the careful architecture of justification he had constructed to survive the choice he had made, the lies he had told, the woman he had driven away with calculated cruelty because his father had threatened to destroy her family entirely if Frederick did not sever the connection with convincing finality. The rain had not ceased its gentle assault upon the windows of 14 Wimpole Street, and Eleanor lay in her narrow bed, watching the rivulets trace their paths down the darkened glass like tears upon a cheek, unable to close her eyes without seeing Frederick's face as it had been that afternoon in the park, unable to quiet her mind enough to allow the mercy of sleep to carry her away from the memories that had clawed their way out of the grave where she had buried them 5 years ago. The fire in her small grate had burned down to embers that cast a faint orange glow across the modest furnishings of her room. The simple wooden dresser where Mr. Whitmore's portrait watched her with kind painted eyes that seemed to hold neither accusation nor reproach. The narrow wardrobe that contained the few black dresses befitting her widowed state. The small writing desk where she composed letters to her married sister in Bath and tallied Mrs. Fairfax's household accounts with the careful precision of a woman who understood the value of every shilling. Mrs. Fairfax had knocked upon her door an hour past, offering chamomile tea and the comfort of her company, her weathered face soft with a concern that asked no questions. Eleanor was not prepared to answer, and Eleanor had declined with what she hoped was convincing composure, claiming only a headache brought on by the weather, though she suspected the elderly widow saw far more than she revealed. Now, in the solitude of the small hours, Eleanor allowed herself to remember what she had forbidden her mind to revisit for so long, the morning Frederick had summoned her to his father's study at Thornfield, and spoken the words that had shattered every dream she had dared to nurture. "I find I have been mistaken in my feelings," he had said, his voice as cold and distant as a winter sky, his eyes refusing to meet hers with the warmth she had grown to depend upon. "And you would do well to forget any understanding you imagined existed between us." She had stood before him in the blue muslin dress he had once said made her eyes shine like summer, and she had felt her heart crack along fault lines she had not known existed, had felt herself becoming something smaller and harder and less capable of hope with every measured syllable that fell from his lips like stones into still water. Yet today, in the park, she had seen something in his face that did not accord with her memory of that cruel dismissal, had seen what looked remarkably like anguish, like regret, like a man who carried a burden far heavier than the casual cruelty she had attributed to him for 5 years, and she did not know what to do with this new information that threatened to upend everything she had believed. She rose from her bed and crossed to the small bookshelf where her prayer book rested, opening it to the page where a pressed violet lay between the leaves, a flower Frederick had picked for her during a walk through the Thornfield Gardens, a flower she had told herself 100 times she kept only because she had forgotten to discard it, and she held it now in trembling fingers while the rain continued its ceaseless weeping against the glass. The morning room at Somerton House had always been Frederick's favourite space in the vast townhouse, its walls papered in soft yellow silk that caught the morning light and transformed even the greyest London day into something approaching warmth. But today, the cheerful colour seemed to mock him as he sat at the breakfast table with his untouched toast growing cold on its plate and his tea cooling in its cup, while Oliver chattered beside him with all the relentless energy of a child who had slept soundly and awakened to a world washed clean by the previous night's rain. Frederick had not slept at all, had spent the hours after Henry's departure staring at the miniature portrait until Eleanor's painted features had blurred before his exhausted eyes. And now he struggled to maintain the appearance of normalcy that his son deserved while his mind remained trapped in the past, cycling endlessly through memories of summer gardens and whispered promises and the terrible morning when he had looked into Eleanor's eyes and spoken the lies that had shattered them both. "Papa," Oliver said, tugging at Frederick's sleeve with sticky fingers that bore evidence of the jam he had enthusiastically applied to his bread, his dark hair still tousled from sleep despite the nurse's best efforts with a comb. "Can we go back to the park today and find the sad lady?" Frederick's heart contracted painfully at the question, at the innocent persistence that saw no reason why the encounter of yesterday should not be repeated, improved upon, transformed into friendship by the simple application of childish goodwill, and he found himself momentarily unable to respond, his throat tight with emotions he could not name and dared not examine too closely. "She looked like she needed a friend," Oliver continued, apparently undeterred by his father's silence, and his small hand reached across the table to touch his wooden horse, the toy that had been his constant companion since Frederick had carved it during the long months of Arabella's illness, when he had needed something to do with his hands besides pray for a woman he had respected but never truly loved. "I could give her my horse," Oliver said, with the devastating generosity of a 4-year-old who had not yet learned to guard his heart against disappointment. "And maybe she would smile and not be sad anymore, because horses always make me feel better when I am sad. And she had such pretty eyes, Papa, even though they were crying." Frederick looked at his son, at the earnest face that held none of Arabella's cool beauty, but radiated instead a warmth that seemed entirely his own, and he wondered how this child had learned such compassion when his own father had spent years building walls against feeling anything at all, and he reached out to smooth Oliver's unruly hair with a tenderness that surprised them both. "Perhaps we might find some flowers instead," Frederick heard himself say, the words emerging before he had consciously decided to speak them, and Oliver's face lit with such pure joy that Frederick felt something shift in his chest, some barrier cracking just enough to let the morning light penetrate the darkness that had settled there 5 years ago when he had chosen duty over love and lost everything that mattered. He would make inquiries about Mrs. Fairfax, he decided, would find a way to see Eleanor again that did not compromise her reputation further, would tell her the truth even if she refused to believe him, because his son had reminded him of something he had forgotten during all those years of careful numbness, that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was simply to offer kindness without expectation and trust that love would find its way home. Lady Pembroke's green drawing-room seemed designed to intimidate, its walls hung with silk the colour of envy, and its furnishings arranged to ensure that every guest could observe and be observed by every other. And Eleanor felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes upon her as she followed Mrs. Fairfax into the afternoon salon on September 22nd. Her best black dress, freshly pressed, but still visibly modest compared to the elaborate gowns of the society matrons who had gathered to exchange gossip over tea served in cups painted with delicate pink roses. She had dreaded this outing for 2 days, had pleaded a headache and then a chill. But Mrs. Fairfax had gently insisted that hiding would only fuel speculation, and so Eleanor had armoured herself in what dignity she could muster, and accompanied her employer into the very heart of the world that had once welcomed her as a gentleman's daughter with promising prospects, and now regarded her as something rather less than a full person, a companion, a dependent, a cautionary tale whispered behind painted fans. Lady Pembroke herself presided over the gathering from a throne-like chair positioned near the fire, her silver hair elaborately dressed, and her sharp eyes missing nothing as they swept over Eleanor with the assessing cruelty of a woman who collected others' misfortunes like precious gems, and when she spoke her voice carried clearly across the room with deliberate precision. "Dear Mrs. Fairfax, how good of you to grace us with your presence, and I see you have brought your little helper. How charming that you provide employment for those who have fallen upon reduced circumstances. It is quite the Christian charity." Eleanor felt the barb sink into her flesh, but kept her expression serene, having learned long ago that showing pain only encouraged further attacks, and she helped Mrs. Fairfax to a seat before positioning herself slightly behind, invisible in the way that companions were meant to be invisible, useful but unremarkable, present but not truly there. The conversation swirled around fashion and scandal and the upcoming Hartfield ball until a younger woman whose name Eleanor did not recall leaned forward with the breathless excitement of someone bearing fresh intelligence and announced that she had seen the Duke of Somerton in Hyde Park just 2 days prior, walking with his little son who was quite the most darling child. And was it not tragic about his poor wife, dead these 2 years? And surely he would be looking to remarry soon for the sake of the boy. Eleanor's heart seized in her chest at the mention of Frederick's name, spoken so casually among the teacups and petit fours, and she focused her gaze upon the carpet with such intensity that she feared she might bore holes through the elaborate pattern, while Lady Pembroke's eyes narrowed with the predatory interest of someone who sensed a story not yet told. Mrs. Fairfax's silver-headed cane tapped once upon the floor, a subtle signal, and she spoke with a lightness that masked steel, remarking that the Duke had always seemed a most devoted father, and that some griefs were not so easily mended as society might wish, and Eleanor loved her in that moment with a fierce gratitude that threatened to undo her careful composure entirely. The private room at White's offered the discretion that Frederick required for this conversation, its dark panelled walls and heavy curtains muffling sound so effectively that one might discuss matters of the heart without fear of reaching the eager ears that seemed to multiply in every corner of London society, and he sat across from Henry Carstairs in the early afternoon light of September 23rd with a determination that had been building since the morning Oliver had asked about bringing flowers to the sad lady, his sleepless nights having crystallized into a desperate need to understand what had become of Eleanor in the 5 years since he had destroyed everything between them with lies spoken to save her from his father's cruelty. Henry regarded him with the wariness of a man who had watched his cousin suffer in silence for half a decade, and now feared what might happen if that silence were finally broken, his fingers wrapped around a glass of port. He had not yet tasted as he listened to Frederick's questions about Eleanor Whitmore, formerly Eleanor Sinclair, the woman who had haunted Frederick's dreams and whom Henry had quietly tracked through the years without ever admitting to doing so. "She married Whitmore within a year of your departure," Henry said carefully, choosing each word as though laying stones across treacherous water, and Frederick felt the blow land somewhere beneath his ribs, confirmation that his cruelty had achieved its intended purpose of driving her into another man's arms, even as it proved she had not simply forgotten him and moved on with the ease he had sometimes tortured himself by imagining. He was a good man by all accounts, Henry continued, a merchant of comfortable means and steady temperament who treated her with kindness and respect, and they lived quietly in a modest house near Cheapside until he took ill with fever this past spring and died within a fortnight, leaving her with little beyond a small annuity that proved insufficient for independent living, which is how she came to be companion to Mrs. Fairfax, who had known her mother years ago. Frederick absorbed this information like a man dying of thirst who has been offered water drop by drop, each detail both relieving and intensifying his guilt, for Eleanor had found kindness with Whitmore, but not love, had built a life from the wreckage he had made of her heart, only to find herself once again bereft and reduced to dependency upon the charity of others. Lady Pembroke remembers her from her come-out, Henry warned, and you know how that woman delights in others' misfortunes, so if you approach Eleanor publicly, you risk exposing whatever connection existed between you and ruining what little reputation she has managed to preserve, through her respectable marriage and widowhood. Frederick thought of Oliver asking to bring flowers to the sad lady, of Eleanor's eyes meeting his across 5 years of silence, of the letter hidden in his desk containing words he had never been brave enough to send, and he leaned forward with an intensity that made Henry set down his glass. "Then help me find a way to see her that protects her reputation," Frederick said, "because I cannot spend another 5 years wondering if she might have forgiven me if only I had found the courage to ask." And Henry nodded slowly, with the resignation of a man who had always known this moment would eventually arrive. The morning of September 26th arrived with pale autumn sunshine that did nothing to calm the trembling in Frederick's hands as his carriage rolled toward 14 Wimpole Street, Henry seated across from him with the expression of a man who had agreed to accompany his cousin into battle while privately doubting the wisdom of the campaign, and Frederick had rehearsed what he would say so many times that the words had lost all meaning, dissolving into sounds without substance each time he tried to arrange them into sentences that might convey even a fraction of what he needed Eleanor to understand. Mrs. Fairfax's blue drawing-room was smaller than he had imagined, its walls papered in a soft shade that reminded him of summer skies, its furnishings modest but comfortable, and he stood just inside the doorway at precisely 11 in the morning, while the elderly widow regarded him with sharp eyes that seemed to see far more than her pleasant smile suggested, her silver-headed cane resting against her chair as she informed him that Mrs. Whitmore was indisposed and unable to receive visitors. Frederick felt his carefully constructed courage begin to crumble until Henry stepped forward with the social grace that had always come more naturally to him than to Frederick, and engaged Mrs. Fairfax in conversation about a mutual acquaintance, his tone light and charming, while his eyes communicated silently with Frederick that he had perhaps 5 minutes to convince the elderly woman to intervene. "I know I have no right to ask anything of her," Frederick said quietly, addressing Mrs. Fairfax with a directness that surprised even himself. "But I wronged her grievously 5 years ago, and I cannot rest until she knows the truth of why I did what I did, even if she never forgives me, even if she sends me away and I never see her again. She deserves to know that she was not the one at fault." Mrs. Fairfax studied him for a long moment, during which Frederick felt certain she could see every secret shame he carried, every sleepless night, every letter written and never sent, and then she rose with a dignity that belied her years and disappeared through a door that led deeper into the house, leaving Frederick to stand in agonized uncertainty while Henry pretended to examine a painting of absolutely no artistic merit. When Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her face was pale as winter moonlight, and her hands were clenched at her sides, and Frederick understood immediately that she had not come willingly, but had been persuaded by a woman who perhaps saw something in his desperate plea that warranted investigation, and the fury in Eleanor's eyes when they met, his nearly drove him back a step. "Your Grace," she said with a formality that cut like broken glass, "I cannot imagine what business brings you to this house." And Frederick watched her move to the tea service with hands that trembled visibly as she poured cups that neither of them would drink, the amber liquid growing cold in delicate china, while Mrs. Fairfax settled into conversation with Henry near the window overlooking the small garden where late roses still bloomed in defiance of the approaching autumn chill. "Mrs. Whitmore," Frederick began, then stopped because her name tasted wrong on his tongue after so many years of whispering Eleanor into empty rooms. "I hoped you might permit me to call upon you and Mrs. Fairfax during your time in London," and Eleanor's laugh held no warmth as she replied that she could not fathom why a duke would wish to spend his mornings in such modest company when all of society surely awaited his attention, her widow's ring catching the light as her fingers tightened around a teacup she had not lifted to her lips. The clock upon the mantel struck the half-hour with a delicate chime that seemed to Eleanor almost mocking in its cheerful indifference to the tempest raging within her chest as she stood gripping the marble edge for support, her knuckles white against the cool stone, while Frederick remained standing across the room with an expression of such desperate longing that she found herself unable to maintain the fury she had summoned as armor against this ambush, and when she spoke, her voice emerged sharp as shattered crystal. "Why are you here?" she demanded. "What possible purpose could be served by your presence in this house after 5 years of silence, after you made your feelings abundantly clear when you told me that I had been nothing more than a summer's entertainment and that I should find some merchant or clerk to marry, since I could never aspire to anything more?" And she watched the words land upon him like physical blows, watched him flinch with each remembered cruelty she flung back at him, yet still he did not look away from her face. "I need to tell you the truth about what happened that summer at Thornfield," Frederick said, his voice rough with emotion he seemed barely able to contain. And Eleanor laughed with a bitterness that tasted like ash upon her tongue. "The truth," she repeated with cold precision. "You told me the truth yourself when you informed me that you had never loved me, that I had merely been convenient and amusing while you rusticated in the country, that you were relieved to return to London and society where proper ladies awaited your attention." Frederick's hand rose toward her, in an instinctive gesture of supplication before stopping mid-air as though he had caught himself on the verge of a transgression he no longer had the right to commit. And his next words emerged so quietly she might have missed them had she not been watching his lips with an attention she despised herself for paying. "I lied," he said simply, and Eleanor felt the floor shift beneath her feet, as though the very foundations of the house had begun to crumble. "Every word I spoke to you that day was a lie designed to make you hate me enough to let me go, and I have regretted it every moment of every day for the past 5 years, have lain awake imagining this very conversation while knowing I had no right to seek it." Eleanor's grip on the mantel tightened until she felt certain she would leave marks in the stone, her heart pounding so violently she could hear nothing beyond its desperate rhythm, and she shook her head in rejection of everything he was attempting to overturn. "You need to leave," she whispered. "You need to leave this house and never return because I cannot bear to hear you speak. Lies about lies. To twist what happened between us into something it never was." And Frederick nodded slowly with an acceptance that somehow wounded her more than argument would have. "I will go," he said, "but I am asking for one chance to explain properly, in writing if you cannot bear to hear my voice, because you deserve to know what really happened even if you never forgive me for it." And Eleanor said nothing as he collected Henry with a glance and departed. The evening of September 26th settled over London with a grey heaviness that matched the turmoil in Eleanor's chest as she sat alone in her small room at 14 Wimpole Street, the letter resting upon her lap like a living thing that might at any moment rise up and strike her, its crimson seal bearing the Somerton crest unbroken despite the 2 hours she had spent turning it over in her trembling hands, while the light faded from the single window and the fire burned low in the modest grate, and Mrs. Fairfax had knocked twice already to inquire whether Eleanor would be joining her for dinner at 7, but Eleanor had pleaded a headache and been left in merciful solitude with this missive that seemed to pulse with all the words Frederick had attempted to speak that morning before she had sent him away. The seal cracked beneath her thumbnail with a sound that felt far too loud in the quiet room, and she unfolded the pages with fingers that would not stop their trembling no matter how sternly she commanded them to be still, and Frederick's handwriting had not changed in 5 years. Still the same bold strokes she remembered from the notes he had once slipped into her prayer book during Sunday services at Thornfield, and the memory of that summer pierced her like a blade freshly sharpened. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began, and she had to stop reading because no one had called her dearest in so very long, and certainly not in his voice, which she could hear as clearly as if he stood beside her speaking the words into the shell of her ear. She forced herself to continue, her eyes moving across lines that told a story she had never known, a story of his father, the old Duke, summoning Frederick to his study on that terrible August morning, and presenting him with documents that would have ruined her father utterly. Debts called in and mortgages foreclosed, and her family cast into the street within a fortnight. If Frederick did not end things immediately and permanently, and Frederick wrote that he had begged and bargained and offered everything he had. But his father had been immovable, had demanded not merely separation, but destruction, had insisted that Frederick hurt her so deeply she would never seek him out again. "I told you I never loved you because it was the only lie cruel enough to set you free," he wrote, "and I have kept your letters tied with the same blue ribbon you wore in your hair the day we walked through the rose garden, and I have never stopped loving you for a single moment of a single day, though I know I forfeited any right to speak those words when I broke your heart to save your family from ruin." Eleanor read the letter 3 times as rain began to tap against her window like gentle fingers seeking entry, and somewhere in the second reading she began to cry with great heaving sobs that shook her entire frame, and she pressed her hand against her mouth to muffle the sounds, while everything she had believed for 5 years crumbled into dust around her, and when she finally set the letter aside, she reached for her prayer book and withdrew the pressed flower she had told herself meant nothing, a yellow rose from Thornfield's garden that had somehow survived all these years, just as her love had survived, despite every effort to kill it. The morning of September the 28th dawned with a crystalline brightness that seemed almost cruel in its cheerfulness. The rain of the previous days having washed London clean and left the air tasting of autumn and possibility, and Frederick walked through Hyde Park with Oliver's small hand clasped firmly in his own, while his heart sat heavy as a stone in his chest, because 2 days had passed since he sent his letter. And Eleanor had not responded, had sent no word at all, and he had begun to accept that perhaps the truth had come too late, that some wounds could not be healed no matter how desperately one wished to undo the damage that had caused them. But Oliver had insisted on this walk with a determination that belied his 4 years, clutching a small bouquet of yellow roses he had picked himself from the garden at Somerton House that morning, while cook pretended not to notice the decimation of her prized bushes, and the boy had declared with solemn certainty that they must find the sad lady because she needed flowers to make her smile, and Oliver could not bear the thought of anyone being sad when flowers existed in the world. Frederick had not the heart to refuse his son nor to explain that the sad lady likely never wished to see Oliver's father again, so he walked and watched and tried to resign himself to disappointment while Oliver scanned every passing figure with the intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. And it was Oliver who spotted her first, his small body going rigid with excitement as he pointed toward a bench near the Serpentine, where 2 women sat in quiet conversation. One elderly with a blue shawl despite the mild weather, and the other slender and dark in widow's black. And before Frederick could stop him, Oliver had torn free of his grasp and was running across the grass with his bouquet held aloft like a banner of peace. Eleanor looked up at the sound of small feet pounding toward her, and her face transformed through a series of expressions. Frederick watched helplessly from a distance, surprise giving way to recognition, giving way to something soft and wondering, as Oliver skidded to a halt before her and thrust the yellow roses toward her chest, with more enthusiasm than grace. "These are for you," Oliver announced breathlessly, "because Papa says ladies like flowers, and you were crying before, and I do not like it when people cry, so I brought you roses from our garden, and cook was cross, but I told her they were important." and Eleanor's eyes lifted from the child's earnest face to find Frederick standing 10 feet away with his heart in his throat and his hands hanging useless at his sides. And for a long moment neither of them spoke, while Mrs. Fairfax watched with barely concealed interest, and Oliver waited with the impatient hope of childhood for his gift to be accepted. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered at last, and she was addressing Oliver, but her eyes remained locked on Frederick's face, and Frederick saw her fingers tremble as she took the roses from his son's outstretched hands, and when she lifted them to breathe in their scent, her lashes were wet with tears that caught the morning light like scattered diamonds. "Yellow roses?" she said softly, and Frederick knew she was remembering Thornfield and the garden where he had first kissed her beneath a canopy of these same golden blooms, and Oliver beamed with satisfaction at having successfully delivered his gift, while something fragile and precious unfurled in the space between two people who had loved and lost, and might perhaps find their way back to each other yet. The moment stretched between them like a golden thread pulled taut, Frederick standing with his hands clasped behind his back to hide their trembling, while Eleanor sat on the bench with Oliver's yellow roses cradled against her chest, and Mrs. Fairfax watched with the satisfied expression of a woman who had seen much of life and recognized the hand of Providence when it moved, and other walkers in the park seemed to sense the gravity of the tableau and gave them wide berth, their curious glances sliding away as though deflected by the intensity of what passed, unspoken between the Duke of Somerton and the widow in her modest black dress. And it was Oliver who broke the silence, as children so often do, climbing onto the bench beside Eleanor without invitation, and peering up at her face with the earnest scrutiny only a 4-year-old can muster. "You are not crying today," Oliver observed with evident satisfaction, and Eleanor laughed, a sound rusty with disuse that made Frederick's heart clench painfully in his chest, because he remembered when she had laughed freely and often, when her joy had been as natural as breathing, and he had been the one to silence that music with his cruelty, even if the cruelty had been born of desperate love. "No," Eleanor agreed softly, looking down at the child who had his father's dark hair and his father's eyes, but none of the shadows that haunted Frederick's gaze. "I am not crying today, thanks to your beautiful flowers." Oliver nodded, as though this was only proper, and then reached into his pocket to withdraw his wooden horse, the same toy he had clutched that first day in the park when he had asked his father why the lady was crying, and he placed it solemnly in Eleanor's lap, beside the roses. "This is Dorian," Oliver explained with the gravity of a diplomat presenting credentials, "and he is very brave, and he helps me when I am sad, and I thought perhaps he might help you too, because Papa says we must always help people who are sad if we can." Eleanor's composure, already fragile, shattered completely at this small act of generosity, and she pressed her hand to her mouth while tears spilled down her cheeks, and Frederick stepped forward instinctively, unable to bear her pain even now, even after everything. "I read your letter," Eleanor whispered without looking up, her fingers closing around the wooden horse as though it were a lifeline. "And I did not know, Frederick, I did not know what your father threatened. I thought all these years that you simply did not want me, that I had been foolish enough to love a man who saw me as nothing more than a summer's diversion," and Mrs. Fairfax quietly rose and extended her hand to Oliver, suggesting they examine the ducks on the Serpentine while the adults conversed, and Oliver went willingly enough after extracting a promise from Eleanor that she would take good care of Dorian, leaving Frederick and Eleanor alone on the bench, with 5 years of silence finally breaking open like ice on a river in spring. Frederick lowered himself onto the bench beside Eleanor, leaving a careful distance between them that felt both necessary and agonizing, and for a long moment they sat in silence, watching Mrs. Fairfax point out various waterfowl to Oliver, who listened with the polite impatience of a child who has more pressing matters on his mind, but knows better than to be rude to elderly ladies, and the yellow roses lay across Eleanor's lap like a bridge between past and present, while the wooden horse Dorian stood guard over them with his painted eyes and chipped ear, and finally Frederick spoke in a voice roughened by sleepless nights and years of regret. "My father told me he would destroy your family if I did not end things between us," he said quietly, keeping his eyes fixed on the Serpentine, where sunlight scattered diamonds across the water. "He had debts he could call in from your father, and connections that could ensure your brother never found a position, and your sister never made a match. And I was 23 years old, and I believed him because he had never made a threat he did not keep. And I thought if I simply told you the truth, you would refuse to let me go. You would insist we could fight him together, and perhaps we could have. But I was not brave enough to risk your family's ruin on that chance." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the roses until thorns she had not noticed bit into her palm, drawing a thin line of blood that she did not acknowledge. And she thought of her father, who had died peacefully 2 years ago, believing his debts were merely unfortunate luck, and her brother who had found a respectable position as a solicitor in Bath, and her sister who had married a clergyman and now had 3 children and a garden full of roses of her own, and she understood with a clarity that cut like glass that all of it, every comfortable, ordinary blessing her family had enjoyed, had been purchased with her heartbreak and Frederick's silence. "So you lied," she said, and her voice was steady even though her hands were not. "You told me you had never loved me, that I had been amusing but nothing more, that a man of your standing could never seriously consider a woman of my circumstances, and you watched me believe every word, and you let me walk away thinking I had been the greatest fool in England." "Yes," Frederick replied, and there was no defense in his tone, no attempt to soften the admission. "I watched your heart break, and I told myself it was kindness, that a clean wound would heal faster than a lingering hope. And then I went home, and I drank myself insensible, and I wrote you 47 letters I never sent because my father burned the first 3, and I knew he would intercept any others." Eleanor turned to look at him then, truly look at him for the first time since they had sat down, and she saw the boy she had loved in the lines of the man before her, older now and marked by griefs she did not yet fully understand, and she saw Oliver by the water's edge, showing Mrs. Fairfax how his wooden horse could gallop through the air, and she felt something shift in her chest, like a key turning in a lock that had been frozen for 5 long years. "Why did you marry her?" Eleanor asked suddenly, and the question hung in the autumn air between them like smoke. And Frederick did not pretend to misunderstand because they had moved beyond such deflections now. They had stepped into a space where only truth could survive, and he turned to face her fully, his dark eyes meeting hers with an openness that made her breath catch because she had never seen him so unguarded, not even during that golden summer when she had believed herself the most fortunate woman in England. "I married Arabella because my father arranged it within 6 months of your departure," he said quietly, "and because I believed you had moved on. I heard you had married Whitmore, and I told myself you had found happiness, and that my sacrifice had been worthwhile, and Arabella was kind and practical, and she knew I did not love her, but she wanted the title and the security, and we made an arrangement that suited us both, and she gave me Oliver, and for that I will always be grateful to her memory, even though our marriage was one of mutual convenience rather than affection." Eleanor absorbed this revelation like rain into parched earth, feeling the landscape of her understanding shift and reform around these new truths, and she thought of Mr. Whitmore, who had offered her the same bargain, a respectable name and a quiet life in exchange for companionship and care, and she had accepted because the alternative was governess work, or worse, and because her heart had already been so thoroughly broken that she believed it could never function again anyway. "We were both so young," she said softly, "and we let others make our choices for us," and Frederick nodded because there was nothing to add to that simple truth, and Oliver's laughter drifted toward them from the water's edge, where he was now attempting to convince Mrs. Fairfax that ducks would certainly appreciate a ride on a wooden horse if only one could catch them. "Do you still have the letters?" Eleanor asked, and her voice was barely above a whisper now. "The 47 letters you never sent." And Frederick reached into his coat and withdrew a small bundle tied with blue ribbon, worn and faded from years of handling, and he placed it in her lap beside the roses and the wooden horse. "I have carried them with me every day since we met again in this park," he confessed. "I did not know if I would ever have the chance to give them to you, but I could not bear to leave them behind." And Eleanor's fingers trembled as she touched the ribbon that matched the one she knew still held her own letters to him, letters she had written and never sent during those dark months after he left, letters that now resided in a box beneath her bed at Mrs. Fairfax's house. "I thought you had forgotten me entirely," she said, and he shook his head with such vehemence that a lock of dark hair fell across his forehead, making him look for a moment like the young man who had kissed her in a moonlit garden 5 years and a lifetime ago. "I have never forgotten you for a single day," Frederick replied, "and every word I wrote is proof of that." And Eleanor clutched the letters to her chest as Oliver came running back with tales of duck adventures, and Mrs. Fairfax followed with a smile that suggested she had seen exactly what she hoped to see. The walk back toward the park gates felt different than any walk Eleanor had taken in 5 years, for Oliver had claimed her left hand with the easy confidence of a child who has decided someone belongs to him, and Frederick walked on her other side close enough that their sleeves occasionally brushed, and Mrs. Fairfax followed behind with Henry Carstairs, who had appeared as if by magic, though Eleanor suspected the magic was of the carefully orchestrated variety, and the bundle of letters pressed against her heart beneath her shawl, where she had tucked them, felt like a second heartbeat. 47. Letters worth of words she had never been allowed to read. 47 letters worth of love she had believed did not exist. And Oliver was telling her about his wooden horse Dorian, and how Dorian had once belonged to his father when his father was a little boy, and how Dorian had a chipped ear from an adventure involving a staircase and a very ambitious attempt at flying, and Eleanor found herself laughing. Actually laughing, the sound foreign in her own throat after so many months of careful silence, and Frederick looked at her when she laughed with an expression that made her chest ache, because it was the same expression he had worn in that moonlit garden 5 years ago, wonder and tenderness and something fierce beneath it all that she had believed was performance, but now understood was simply Frederick, simply the man who had loved her enough to break both their hearts rather than watch her family destroyed. Oliver tugged at her hand as they approached the gates and asked in his clear child's voice if she would come to tea at their house, because he wanted to show her his nursery and his collection of painted soldiers and the window seat where his father read him stories every night before bed. And Eleanor looked at Frederick over the boy's dark head and saw the question there too, not demanding but hoping, and she thought of all the reasons she should say no, the gossip that would follow, the wounds still raw beneath fragile new scabs, the terrifying vulnerability of allowing herself to hope again, after hope had nearly destroyed her once before. And then she thought of the letters against her heart, and the yellow roses now held carefully in her other hand, and the way Oliver's small fingers felt wrapped around hers with such perfect trust, and she heard herself say, yes, yes, she would come to tea, and Oliver cheered, and Frederick's eyes went bright with something that might have been tears in a man who permitted himself such things, and Mrs. Fairfax behind them made a small sound of satisfaction that suggested she had been hoping for exactly this outcome all along. They parted at the gates with a formality that felt almost absurd given what had passed between them on that bench, Frederick bowing over her hand and his lips brushing her knuckles for just a moment longer than propriety demanded, and Oliver waving frantically from beside his father's carriage and calling out that she must not forget, tomorrow at 4, and Eleanor watched them drive away with the roses clutched to her chest and the letters burning against her skin, and the first fragile, tender shoots of something like happiness beginning to unfurl in the garden of her heart that she had believed forever barren. The next afternoon found Eleanor standing before the mirror in her small room at Mrs. Fairfax's house, and she barely recognized the woman who stared back at her, because something had shifted in her face overnight, some subtle softening around the eyes that spoke of hope she had not permitted herself in years, and she smoothed her black dress with trembling hands, and wondered what madness had possessed her to accept a child's invitation to tea at the home of the man who had once shattered her heart so completely. She had believed the pieces could never be gathered again, and Mrs. Fairfax appeared in the doorway with a knowing smile and said that she looked lovely and that she should stop fussing because the Duke's carriage had arrived, and it would not do to keep a 4-year-old waiting when he had been promised a guest. And Eleanor descended the stairs on legs that felt uncertain beneath her, and found Frederick himself waiting in the entrance hall rather than merely sending his carriage. And he was dressed impeccably in a dark blue coat that made his eyes seem deeper somehow, and he bowed over her hand with a formality that felt like armor against the intensity of what passed between their eyes. And the carriage ride to Somerton House passed in a blur of small talk and silence, and the occasional brush of shoulders when the carriage swayed, and Eleanor clutched the letters she had read 3 times through the night. 47 letters that had rewritten every certainty she had held for 5 years. 47 letters full of anguish and love, and the desperate hope that somehow she would understand that his cruelty had been the cruelest kindness he could offer. And when the carriage stopped before the imposing facade of Somerton House, she felt suddenly small and uncertain, a companion in widow's weeds entering the home of a duke. But then Oliver came bursting through the front door with his nurse, chasing behind him, calling for decorum, and he flung himself at Eleanor's skirts and declared that she had come. She had actually come, and Papa had said she would, but Oliver had worried she might forget. And Eleanor laughed and bent down to his level, and assured him she would never forget a promise made to a gentleman who gave her flowers. And Oliver beamed, and grabbed her hand and began tugging her toward the house, while Frederick followed behind with an expression of such tender wonder that Eleanor felt her heart crack open further, and the nursery was everything Oliver had promised, painted soldiers lined up on shelves, and a window seat piled with cushions and books with worn spines from frequent reading. And Oliver showed her each treasure with the earnest pride of a child sharing his whole world. And Frederick stood in the doorway watching them with tears. He did not bother to hide, and Eleanor thought that perhaps this was what healing looked like, not a sudden mending, but a slow, gentle unfurling, a flower opening toward sun it had believed would never shine again. Tea in the nursery became tea in the small family parlor when Oliver declared that the sad lady who was not sad anymore must see the portrait of his mother in heaven. And Frederick watched Eleanor's face carefully as they descended the stairs together, Oliver chattering between them like a small, determined bridge spanning the chasm of years. And the portrait hung above the fireplace in the rose parlor, Lady Arabella Ashworth rendered in oils with her cool blonde beauty and distant smile. And Eleanor stopped before it with an expression Frederick could not quite read, and Oliver tugged at her hand and said that was his mamma, and she went to live with the angels when he was very small, and he did not remember her very well, but Papa said she was kind. And Eleanor looked at Frederick then with a question in her eyes that he understood without words, and he found himself telling her the truth he had never spoken aloud to anyone, that his marriage to Arabella had been arranged by their fathers when they were children, that Arabella had loved another man, whom her family deemed unsuitable, that they had both entered their union with broken hearts and had found in each other not passion but a gentle mutual respect, a shared understanding of duty and loss, and that Arabella had died of a fever 2 years ago, having given him the gift of Oliver, and having forgiven him for never being able to love her as she deserved. And Eleanor's eyes filled with tears that she did not try to hide. And she said she was sorry, truly sorry, because she had spent 5 years imagining him happy with a wife he adored, imagining that she alone had suffered while he built a life of joy without her. And Frederick shook his head and said he had spent 5 years imagining much the same of her, that she had married Mr. Whitmore and found the happiness Frederick could not give her. And Oliver looked between them with the peculiar wisdom children sometimes possess, and announced that grown-ups were very silly, because if they had simply talked to each other instead of imagining things they would not have been so sad for so long. And both Frederick and Eleanor laughed at that, a startled, shared laughter that broke something loose in both their chests. And Mrs. Fairfax, who had been waiting in the entrance hall, appeared in the doorway with Henry Carstairs beside her and declared that the child had more sense than all of them combined. And Oliver beamed at the praise and asked if Eleanor would come again tomorrow, because he had not yet shown her his painted soldiers properly, and Dorian the wooden horse wished to make her formal acquaintance. And Eleanor looked at Frederick, and he looked back at her, and neither of them spoke. But something passed between them, a fragile, trembling thing like the first green shoot pushing through frost-hardened ground. And Eleanor said yes, she would come tomorrow if his grace permitted. And Frederick said he would send his carriage at whatever hour suited her, and Oliver cheered and declared this was the best day since Christmas. And Eleanor bent to embrace the boy who had somehow become the architect of her heart's slow resurrection. The days that followed became a gentle rhythm of visits and small discoveries. October arriving with its golden light and crisp mornings, and Eleanor found herself at Somerton House so frequently that the staff began to greet her with warm familiarity rather than formal distance. And Oliver bloomed under her attention like a flower too long kept in shadow, showing her his painted soldiers one afternoon and his collection of interesting rocks the next, and his drawings of horses that looked more like dogs, but which Eleanor praised with genuine enthusiasm, and Frederick watched them together with an expression that made Eleanor's heart ache with something perilously close to hope. And they began to talk during these visits, really talk, not the careful formal exchanges of those first terrible encounters, but true conversation about books and music and memories of the years they had lost. And Eleanor learned that Frederick had become a dedicated reformer in Parliament, championing causes for workers and children that would have horrified his late father. And Frederick learned that Eleanor had taught herself Italian during her marriage to Mr. Whitmore, and had read every book in his modest library twice over, and they discovered that they still laughed at the same observations, and still finished each other's thoughts, and still felt that electric awareness when their hands accidentally touched over a teacup or a picture book, and Mrs. Fairfax and Henry Carstairs became co-conspirators in creating opportunities for them to be together, arranging outings and dinners and afternoons where the four of them, plus Oliver, formed a peculiar little family of misfits and second chances. And one evening in mid-October, as Eleanor prepared to leave after a particularly long visit, Oliver threw his arms around her waist and declared that he wished she could stay forever and ever and never go away. And Eleanor looked up to find Frederick watching her with such naked longing that she could not breathe. And he said Oliver's name in gentle reprimand, but his eyes said something else entirely. And that night in her small room, Eleanor allowed herself for the first time to imagine a future she had believed impossible, a future where she might wake in that great house and call Oliver her own and feel Frederick's arms around her, not in memory but in truth. And she pressed her hands to her burning cheeks and told herself she was being foolish, that a duke did not marry his former love, who had become a widow of no fortune working as a companion, that society would never accept such a match, that Lady Pembroke and her ilk would tear Eleanor apart with their whispers and their cruelty. But then she remembered the way Frederick had looked at her, and the way Oliver had clung to her skirts, and the way Mrs. Fairfax had smiled knowingly as they departed, and she thought, perhaps, the word beating in her chest like a second heart, and she did not sleep that night. But for the first time in 5 years, her wakefulness was not from grief, but from something that felt terrifyingly like joy. The Hartfield ball arrived on the evening of October the 20th with all the glittering anticipation that society could muster, and Eleanor stood before the mirror in Mrs. Fairfax's guest chamber, wearing a gown of deep midnight blue that Mrs. Fairfax had insisted on purchasing for her despite Eleanor's protests, declaring that no companion of hers would attend the most important ball of the autumn season in mourning black when 6 months had passed, and Mr. Whitmore himself would have wanted her to live again. And Eleanor barely recognized the woman who looked back at her from the glass, her eyes bright with something that might have been hope, her cheeks flushed with color that owed nothing to rouge, and Mrs. Fairfax appeared in the doorway and pronounced her a vision and said that certain dukes would find themselves unable to look anywhere else this evening, and Eleanor tried to protest that she had no expectations. But Mrs. Fairfax merely laughed and handed her a pair of long white gloves that were clearly new and clearly expensive and said, "Nonsense, my dear, we both know exactly what is happening, and it is time you stopped pretending otherwise." And the carriage ride to Hartfield Manor passed in a blur of gaslight and anticipation. And when they entered the ballroom, Eleanor felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, whispers beginning like wind through autumn leaves, and she heard Lady Pembroke's carrying voice somewhere to her left pronouncing that some people certainly had ideas above their station, and what was Mrs. Fairfax thinking dressing up her companion like a debutante? And Eleanor's courage nearly failed her then, but she felt Mrs. Fairfax's hand firm on her arm, and heard her employer say in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry that she was thinking Eleanor Whitmore was the finest woman in this room, and that anyone who disagreed was welcome to find other drawing rooms to visit this season. And then the crowd seemed to part, and there was Frederick standing at the edge of the dance floor with Henry Carstairs beside him, and Oliver nowhere to be seen. For this was an adult affair, and Frederick was staring at Eleanor as though she were the sun emerging from behind clouds after endless rain, and he crossed the distance between them with steps that society would later describe as unseemly in their haste. And he bowed over her hand and said she looked like starlight made flesh, and would she honour him with the first dance? And Eleanor heard the gasps rippling outward. From where they stood, heard Lady Pembroke's outraged intake of breath, heard the furious whispers beginning about dukes and companions and what the world was coming to. But when she looked into Frederick's eyes, she found she did not care, not even a little, not even at all, and she placed her hand in his and said yes, as though that single word contained every answer to every question she had ever been asked, and Frederick led her onto the floor as the orchestra began to play. The waltz began, and Eleanor felt Frederick's hand at her waist, and his other hand clasping hers, and the world beyond their small circle of movement seemed to fade into watercolor blurs of candlelight and silk and watching faces, and she could not look away from his eyes, which held her with an intensity that made her forget every cruel whisper and every pointed stare and every year of loneliness that had led to this moment. And Frederick guided her through the steps with an assurance that spoke of countless ballrooms, and yet his hand trembled slightly where it touched her waist, as though he too could scarcely believe this was real. And he said quietly, so only she could hear, that he had dreamed of dancing with her for 5 years, and that reality far exceeded every midnight imagining, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely because she would not give Lady Pembroke the satisfaction of seeing her weep. And she said instead that she had forgotten how well he danced, and Frederick smiled and said he had forgotten nothing about her, and never would forget anything for as long as he drew breath. And the music swelled around them, and other couples joined the floor, but Eleanor was aware only of Frederick's nearness, and the warmth of his hand, and the way his thumb traced small circles against her gloved palm, as though he could not help touching her, however propriety allowed. And when the dance ended, he did not release her immediately, but stood holding her hand, while the final notes faded and the applause scattered through the room, and then he lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it with a reverence that silenced the whispers nearby, and made Lady Pembroke's fan snap closed in outrage, and he asked if she would take the air with him on the terrace, and Eleanor heard Mrs. Fairfax encouraging murmur somewhere behind her, and Henry Carstairs positioning himself to deflect any interference, and she placed her hand on Frederick's arm and let him lead her through the French doors into the cool October night, where lanterns glowed among the dying roses, and the stars spread overhead like scattered diamonds, and they walked in silence for a moment until they reached the far end of the terrace, where shadows pooled and the noise of the ballroom became distant music and muffled laughter, and Frederick turned to face her, and took both her hands in his, and said, Eleanor, with such tenderness that her heart cracked open along the fault lines of every old wound, and he said he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, and now every prepared word had fled, and all he could offer was the simple truth that he had loved her 5 years ago, with everything he was, and he loved her still, and he would love her until his last breath and beyond if such things were possible, and Eleanor felt the tears spill over at last, warm tracks down her cold cheeks, and Frederick released one hand to brush them away with infinite gentleness, and asked if he had any hope at all, or if he should resign himself to loving her from whatever distance she required. Eleanor looked up at Frederick through the blur of tears, and felt the walls she had built so carefully over 5 long years begin to crumble like ancient stone beneath the weight of too much rain, and she heard herself say his name not as a title, but as she had once spoken it in summer gardens, when the world was young and possibilities stretched endless before them. And Frederick made a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and pulled her closer, though not into an embrace, because even here in the shadows propriety had some claim. And Eleanor said she had believed for so long that she meant nothing to him, and that believing it was the only way she survived. And now he was asking her to unmake that belief and build something new from the ruins, and she did not know if she had the strength. And Frederick said she was the strongest woman he had ever known, and that her strength had haunted him through every empty year, and he was not asking her to forget the pain he caused, but only to let him spend whatever time remained to them, proving that she had always been loved, and that his love had never wavered, even when his courage failed. And Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, like a key turning in a lock that had rusted closed. And she said she was afraid, because the last time she trusted him, he had shattered her so completely that she did not know how she would survive a second breaking. And Frederick lifted her hands to his lips and kissed each knuckle with such reverence that she trembled, and he said he would rather cut out his own heart than cause her pain again, and if she needed time he would wait, and if she needed distance he would keep it, and if she needed proof he would spend every remaining day of his life providing it. And from the ballroom the music swelled into something achingly beautiful, and the lantern light caught the tears on both their faces, turning them to scattered diamonds. And Eleanor looked at this man who had been her first love and her deepest wound, and who stood before her now with his soul laid bare and his pride abandoned at her feet. And she thought of Oliver's yellow roses and his earnest declaration that ladies should not cry. And she thought of Mrs. Fairfax's gentle encouragement, and she thought of the pressed flower in her prayer book that she had kept through marriage and widowhood and all the hollow years between. And she realized that she had never stopped loving him, not even when she hated him most, and she said yes in a voice barely above a whisper. And Frederick went absolutely still, as though afraid any movement might dispel the dream. And she said yes, she would let him prove himself, and yes, she would try to trust again. And yes, she believed that he had loved her all along. And Frederick gathered her into his arms, then propriety forgotten, and held her against his chest where she could feel his heart racing beneath the fine fabric of his evening coat. And he whispered into her hair that she had made him the happiest man in England, and that he would not fail her again. They returned to the ballroom together, and Eleanor felt the weight of every gaze upon them. But Frederick's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, and his thumb traced reassuring circles against her gloved fingers. And she found that the whispers which had once cut like sharpened blades now seemed distant and insignificant, like the buzzing of insects on a summer afternoon. And Mrs. Fairfax beamed at them from her position near the refreshment table, where Henry Carstairs had stationed himself as her faithful attendant throughout the evening. And Lady Pembroke's face had gone an alarming shade of puce that clashed terribly with her emerald gown, and her fan worked so furiously that the feathers threatened to take flight, and Frederick guided Eleanor through the crowd with the easy authority of a man who had never questioned his place in the world, and yet his eyes kept returning to her face, as though he still could not quite believe she was real, and beside him, and willing to try. And they reached Mrs. Fairfax and Henry, and Frederick bowed to the elderly woman with a warmth that made Eleanor's heart expand painfully in her chest, and he said that he owed Mrs. Fairfax a debt he could never repay for her care of Eleanor during the years when he had failed so terribly. And Mrs. Fairfax laughed and tapped his arm with her silver-headed cane and said nonsense, and that she expected him to repay that debt by ensuring Eleanor never had cause to weep again except from joy. And Frederick said solemnly that he intended to spend every remaining day of his life in pursuit of that goal, and Eleanor felt the tears threaten once more, and blinked them back, and thought of Oliver asking why the lady was crying, and wondered what he would say when he learned that sometimes ladies cried because they were happy too, and Henry clapped Frederick on the shoulder and said it was about time, and that he had begun to despair of his cousin ever finding the courage to seize happiness with both hands. And the orchestra began another waltz, and couples swirled past them in a blur of silk and candlelight. And Eleanor felt as though she stood in the eye of a storm where everything was suddenly calm and clear, and Frederick leaned close and murmured that he wished to call upon Mrs. Fairfax tomorrow if Eleanor would receive him, and that he had a question he wished to ask her, properly without the distraction of gossips and gawkers. And Eleanor's breath caught because she knew what question he meant, and her heart answered yes before her mind could form the word, and she said she would receive him, and that Oliver might accompany him if he wished, because she found she rather missed the company of a small boy with yellow roses and earnest declarations. And Frederick smiled, and it transformed his face from handsome to radiant, and he said, Oliver had been asking daily when they might visit the lady who smiled like sunshine, and the night stretched before them, full of promise and possibility. And the whispers continued. But Eleanor no longer heard them, because Frederick was looking at her as though she were the only woman in the room, and perhaps in all the world. The morning after the Hartfield ball dawned clear and golden, and Eleanor woke to find that the world had not ended, despite everything changing, and that the sun still rose in the east, and the birds still sang in Mrs. Fairfax's small garden, and her heart still beat beneath her ribs, though it felt somehow lighter than it had in 5 long years. And she dressed with trembling hands, knowing that Frederick would come today, and that he would bring Oliver, and that he would ask her a question that would determine the course of all her remaining days. And Mrs. Fairfax appeared in her doorway with knowing eyes and a warm smile, and said only that Eleanor should wear the grey silk, because it brought out the blue of her eyes, and because mourning had its limits, and joy deserved acknowledgment too, and Eleanor protested that she was still in mourning for Mr. Whitmore, but Mrs. Fairfax said gently that Samuel Whitmore had been a good man, who wanted nothing more than Eleanor's happiness, and that he would not begrudge her this chance at the love she had always deserved. And Eleanor's eyes filled with tears at the mention of her late husband's kindness, and she thought of how he had saved her when she was drowning, and how he had never asked for more than she could give, and how he had told her on his deathbed that she should not waste her life grieving for an old man when there was still so much living to be done. And so she put on the grey silk, and pinned her hair, and went downstairs to wait in the blue drawing-room, where the autumn sunlight streamed through the windows and turned everything to gold. And at precisely 11 o'clock, the knocker sounded, and Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat, and she heard voices in the hallway, and then the door opened, and there was Frederick, looking as though he too had not slept, but also as though he carried the sun within him. And beside him Oliver bounced with barely contained excitement, clutching a fresh bouquet of yellow roses that seemed to glow against his small hands. And Oliver broke free from his father and ran to Eleanor and thrust the flowers toward her and said, "These are for you, because Papa says you are going to be my new mamma. And I am very glad, because I have always wanted a mamma who smiles like sunshine." And Eleanor looked up at Frederick through a blur of tears, and saw that he had gone quite pale, and was clearly mortified that his son had revealed the nature of his errand before he could make his carefully planned speech. And she laughed for the first time in what felt like years, and the sound surprised her because it was full and genuine, and came from somewhere deep within her chest, where hope had taken root again. And she knelt down to Oliver's level and said that she would be very honoured to be his mamma if his papa asked properly. And Oliver turned to Frederick with an expression of profound exasperation that was far too old for his 4 years, and said, "Papa, you must ask properly. The lady is waiting." And Frederick laughed too, then, and the sound mingled with Eleanor's, and filled the blue drawing-room with something that felt remarkably like joy. And he crossed the room and took Eleanor's hands in his, and sank to one knee beside his son. Frederick knelt before her on the carpet of Mrs. Fairfax's blue drawing-room, with Oliver pressed close against his side, and the yellow roses clutched in Eleanor's trembling hands, filling the air with their sweet fragrance. And he looked up at her with eyes that held no trace of the proud, distant duke she had encountered in Hyde Park all those weeks ago, but only the man she had loved in the summer gardens of Thornfield, when the world had seemed full of nothing but possibility and light. And he said, "Eleanor, I have rehearsed this speech 1,000 times in my mind, and yet now that you are here before me, I find that all my careful words have fled, and I am left with only the truth, which is that I loved you 5 years ago with everything I had, and I love you still with everything I am, and I will love you until I draw my last breath, and beyond if such things are permitted, and I know that I do not deserve your forgiveness for the pain I caused you, and I know that I cannot undo the years we lost, or give back what my cowardice stole from us both. But I am asking you, Eleanor, if you will allow me to spend whatever years remain to us proving that you were always the only woman who held my heart." And Oliver tugged at his father's sleeve and whispered rather loudly, "Papa, you forgot to ask the question." And Frederick laughed even as tears gathered in his eyes, and he reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box that he opened to reveal a ring that Eleanor recognized with a sharp intake of breath, because it was not a new ring purchased for this occasion, but the very ring he had shown her in secret all those years ago, when they had whispered of a future his father would never allow. And Frederick said, "I have kept this ring for 5 years, waiting for the moment I might have the courage to give it to you, as I should have done then, and I am asking you now. Eleanor Whitmore, who was once Eleanor Sinclair, and who I pray will consent to become Eleanor Ashworth, will you marry me and be my wife, and be a mother to Oliver, who already loves you, and allow me to cherish you for all the days we have remaining?" And Eleanor sank to her knees before him, so that they were face to face, and Oliver squeezed between them, and she cupped Frederick's face in her hands and said yes, and yes, and yes again, because one yes did not seem sufficient to contain the magnitude of her answer. And Oliver cheered and threw his small arms around both their necks, nearly toppling all 3 of them to the floor, and Mrs. Fairfax appeared in the doorway, with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, and her silver-headed cane tapping approval against the floor. And Frederick slipped the ring onto Eleanor's finger where it fit, as though it had always belonged there, waiting patiently through 5 years of sorrow for its rightful place. And he kissed her then, with Oliver giggling between them and the yellow roses crushed and fragrant, and the autumn sunlight turning everything to gold. The news of the Duke of Somerton's engagement to the widow Whitmore spread through London society like fire through dry grass, and within hours of Frederick's departure from Wimpole Street, the drawing-rooms and salons of Mayfair hummed with speculation and scandal, and no small amount of outrage from those who had hoped to secure the wealthy widower Duke for their own daughters. And Lady Pembroke was among the first to hear the news, and her green eyes narrowed with vicious delight as she contemplated the delicious gossip she would spread about the former companion, who had somehow ensnared one of the most eligible men in England. And she wasted no time in reminding everyone who would listen that Eleanor Sinclair, as she had been known in her youth, had been a nobody of no fortune and no particular beauty, who had somehow attached herself to the young heir of Somerton years ago, before being cast aside as was only proper, and now it seemed the creature had wormed her way back into his affections through who knew what arts, and it was really quite shocking that a man of his standing would lower himself so dramatically when there were perfectly suitable young ladies of good family who would have been honoured to accept his addresses. But for every Lady Pembroke who sneered and whispered, there were others who saw the romance in the tale, and who noted how the Duke looked at his intended bride as though she were the only woman in the world, and how she looked at him with eyes that held both joy and a tender sorrow that spoke of years of longing finally fulfilled. And Mrs. Fairfax received no fewer than 15 callers that first afternoon, all of them burning with curiosity, and she turned them all away with the serene explanation that Mrs. Whitmore was indisposed, but would be receiving visitors once the formal announcement appeared in the papers. And Eleanor herself spent that afternoon in a daze of happiness, moving through the house as though walking on clouds, and stopping every few minutes to look at the ring on her finger and assure herself that it was real, and that Frederick had truly knelt before her and asked her to be his wife, and that Oliver had called her Mama, and that the years of grief and loneliness were finally truly over, and Frederick returned to Somerton House with Oliver chattering happily beside him about his new mamma and the flowers and how she had cried. But they were happy tears, Papa. I could tell, because she was smiling too, and Frederick lifted his son in his arms and held him close and thanked God and every saint he could name for the innocent question in Hyde Park that had led them to this moment, and for the small boy whose pure heart had seen what society refused to see, and who had loved Eleanor simply because she was sad and needed kindness. And that evening Frederick sat down to write the formal announcement for the papers, and found that his hand was trembling, and that tears were blurring his vision because he was writing Eleanor's name beside his own as he should have done 5 years ago.